Hi and welcome to my channel. This video is about Java Spring Boot. Before moving on, do check out my YouTube channel Vimara Hub. It has various technical topics ranging from Angular, Java, AWS, MySQL and many more. Don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell icon for the latest notifications. So let's try to answer this question that what exactly is Spring Boot? Why is it so famous? And if Java already has a framework known as Spring, why do we need a new framework known as Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one of the most popular and most used frameworks of Java programming language. It is based on microservices and helps in creating production-ready applications quickly. It is based on convention over configuration model, and it has starter POMS which can be configured with defaults and helps in creating quick applications. It helps in getting started easily, and it requires minimum immediate knowledge of dependencies. Now let's see what is the difference between Spring Boot and Spring and how it is more useful than the Spring framework. Spring is the most widely used scalable application framework, but there is a drawback to Spring projects, that it is the time-taking and a bit tedious for new developers. So to make production-ready environment, we have Spring Boot. So now let's get started with developing a Spring Boot application. So there are multiple ways in which you can actually create a Spring Boot application, and all the ways are pretty simple and quick than creating a Spring application. So if you log into spring.io, the official website for Spring, if you scroll down, you can see what all Spring can do. We can create microservices, reactive cloud and web apps using Spring, and many more things. So if you go to microservices, you can see to create microservices, Spring provides the solution, that is microservices with Spring Boot. So let's go to that option and click on Quick Start Guide, and if you see step 1 to start a Spring project, it provides an option to use start.spring.io. so that's a website for spring.io in which you can actually start creating a new Spring Boot project online and then download that project and start working on it. So you can create a skeleton for your Spring Boot project directly from the Spring website, or there are options inside the developer tool, the IDEs like Eclipse, STS or IntelliJ. You can use that to create your Spring Boot project, but you can also directly do it using start.spring.io. So if I log into start.spring.io, you see there is an option to create a project, either a Maven or a Gradle project. You can even change the language from Java to Kotlin or Groovy, but I'll stick on Java and I'll stick on a Maven project. And here you can give the versions of Spring Boot. So the versions of Spring Boot would be different from the Spring versions, and you can use the latest one or any stable one. So let it be 2.7.2 which we choose for Spring Boot. And if you have created a Spring application, you would know that normally you will provide the group, artifact and package names for the Spring. So similarly for the Spring Boot also you can provide that. So let's create a group com.vimara and let it be artifact having name Spring Boot, and it's a demo project for Spring Boot, and this will be my package name. I'll keep the packaging to jar, so because while developing microservices we normally develop jar files and deploy jar files instead of var. I'll keep the Java version to 11, not going to a two higher versions. And here you see an option where I can add dependencies. So the dependencies for a Spring project, normally you would have to keep on adding in the pom.xml, and every time you use some dependency, you have to add that in your pom.xml and you have to maintain the pom.xml manually. But when you are using Spring Boot, you could actually add the dependencies directly using add dependency. So if, for example, I want to create a web application, I'll use Spring Web. So I'll select that. Maybe I'll need some more basic dependencies, like if I'm using a database, say for example if I'm using Mongo and I'll require a Spring Data MongoDB to connect, so maybe I can use that dependency. And there can be many more dependencies which you can add, like you can add Lombok for annotations, or according to your project requirement you can keep on adding dependencies here, or else later on using your pom.xml you can add the dependencies just like in a Spring project. But here you have the option to start a Spring Boot application soon and quick without getting into the configurations manually. Here you can auto configure them as the requirement for your projects are, because the basic requirements anyways you would be familiar with, so you can add those dependencies. So here I'm adding those dependencies, and I can either share this particular configuration which I've created, or I can even generate the project. So it's a zip file which has downloaded, so let's open that. So I have opened it here, the Spring Boot application which we had downloaded from online after creating using the starter website. So this is the project. I am using IntelliJ IDE. You can easily download it from the internet, or you can use Eclipse or STS. This is IntelliJ from JetBrains. And in this Spring Boot project you can see this is the project structure. We have the pom.xml which you also have in Spring, and this pom.xml, if you open it you can see it has some dependencies which are already present, the group ID which we gave, the artifact ID, description which we gave online, and also the dependencies which we added, like we had added for MongoDB, we had added for web, and we had added for Lombok. So all those are already present. And also there is a default dependency that is for Spring Boot starter. So all these dependencies are pre-fed into your pom.xml, and you did not have to add it manually one by one as per your requirement. And if you open the src folder you can see that there is a Spring Boot application.java file. So this is your starter class which would start your application. And also there is a resource folder which has an application.properties file. So this application.properties, it could also be of format YAML, it could also be application.yaml. So this configuration file is the Spring Boot configuration file which you can use to configure various things, like the port in which you want to start the application, or maybe some other environment variables which you want to use in your project. You could add it here. So let's see what we have in Spring Boot application.java file, which is the only Java file which you have by default. You also have in resources some folders like static and templates, that's for storing the static HTML pages or the web pages, because you have created a web application. Now if I open the Spring Boot application.java, you can see a class with a main method, and the main method is just calling a run method, that is, it's calling this class. So basically this is the starter class wherein your application will begin. And you can see an annotation here, Spring Boot application. So what this Spring Boot application signifies is that it is used to mark the configuration class that declares one or more bean methods. So it states that this is a configuration class and it can have one or more bean methods, and also triggers auto configuration and component scanning. So it would auto configure, so that is something which is only for Spring Boot. In Spring there is nothing available to have auto configurations. You have to have your configurations mapped by yourself, but by using Spring Boot application annotation, you are enabling auto configuration and also component scanning, that is to scan all the project for the different components which you have marked. And basically it is same as declaring a class with @configuration, @enable auto configuration and component scan annotations. So it's like a combination of all three. That's what a Spring Boot application annotation is. So now to run this application, when you have created it using the Spring Boot starter, you have been provided with a CMD or a bat file which can be run on the file path, and that would actually start your server. It will build a Maven build on your application, and also it will create the jar in the target folder, and then it will start your service. Or else you could start your service from the run. So if you go to run, you could just use spring boot run in the Maven configuration, and when you run this will first build the jar. So it will download all the dependencies for the jar which you have stated in the POMS.xml, and then it will compile the code, and then it will start the service. That is, it starts the service from the embedded Tomcat which the Spring Starter service or the Spring Boot starter has provided from the POMS.xml. So this Spring Boot starter has actually an embedded Tomcat. So in a Spring project you had to create a Tomcat server separately, and you had to deploy your var file or jar file in that. But here we have a Spring Boot service or a Spring Boot application, and we have an embedded Tomcat in that. So that's why this is starting, after it's built, it's starting using that embedded Tomcat. And you see that after it starts with all the details, and it says Tomcat started on port 8080, but there is an exception. The exception is for the MongoDB driver. So because you had given MongoDB while selecting the dependencies, you had taken the dependency for Mongo database. So Spring is searching for the Mongo database in your local system to connect to it, but it's not present, so that's why it's breaking. So let's just start a Mongo. So I have a Mongo database installed in my local. I'm just going to start it using the command mongod. So it's getting started, and now it's listening on the port. So now let's try to restart it and see if the error still exists. So it's again going to compile the code, and then again it will start our service on that embedded Tomcat. So you can see the Tomcat is started and the service initialization has completed. So basically your application is up and running in minutes. So you just had to set up your configuration through the starter, and you just downloaded their project. So right now this project does not contain anything, it's just a plain project with a starter class, but still the startup was quick. You just had to configure a few things. If you didn't have the MongoDB dependency, so if you didn't require it, so if the project is something which does not require a database or it does not require MongoDB, you can just simply remove the dependency, and then you will not require the MongoD which I had started in my local. So now so there's also other ways to create a new Spring Boot project other than going to the starter website. You can actually start from the IDE itself. If you click on File, New Project, So there are other options like Java, Maven, or which type of project you want. And if you click on Spring Initializer, you can select the version of Java which you want to create on. And if the starter service is something else, so this is the default starter service which Spring provides. If it is something else, you can provide the URL here. Click on Next. So you can give the group, artifact, Java, jar or var, and the versions and stuffs like that. Click on Next, and here is where you can search the dependencies which you want. So if you want something as a web application, you can add the web dependencies. Maybe if you want something for web services, you can add Spring Web Services. If you want something for testing, there would be maybe some dependencies for testing like REST docs. Or if you want something for security, there would be Spring Security or OAuth, or whatever you want to add to your project, or maybe LDAP. You can add those, and then when you click on Next, the new project will be created when you click on Finish, and all those dependencies which you added would be added to the pom.xml. So the application which we created was just a plain Spring Boot application. It just had a main class, and it did not do any functionality as such because we had not written anything inside it. So now let's make it a REST controller class so that we can make an endpoint for this and see output for this Spring Boot application which we created. So I'm going to create a REST controller annotation. So this would mark this Spring Boot application also as a REST controller class, and I'll add the imports for that. And I'll also add a method, a get method. So this get mapping is to the root hello, and there is a request param name whose default value is world, and also I'm printing hello and that value which is passed. So this is just a basic /hello path parameter which I am passing, and then this is an endpoint which I have created. Now in the application properties, I had said that we can do multiple things. So before starting the server, let's just change the port. So I can do like server.port, and maybe I can change it to 8085. So the default is 8080 and I've changed it to 8085. So now just let's start the service. So with the new code, it is compiling, and again it's going to deploy in the Tomcat automatically. I did not have to do a manual deployment as in the case of the Spring. And now the service is up. So let's just open a Chrome. I'll go to the path localhost colon 8085, and my get path was /hello. So it has printed hello world, and as given in the program, I can also pass some values. So hello favor. So yeah, so that's about a simple program which we had done. Now we can have a full-fledged microservice itself created by having different components required added to this particular project, and then we can directly deploy the jar into the Tomcat and we can test it, and then we can even move it to a Docker container service and deploy it to separate environment. So we'll do all that in upcoming videos. For now, this is it about Spring Boot basics. We will be doing more stuffs by connecting to the MongoDB service which we just had started, and we have already given the dependency for it. So we'll create endpoints and we'll create an application wherein those endpoints would connect to the database, maybe write data and read data. And later on we'll also see how we can integrate this Spring Boot application with front-end applications like a Flutter application or maybe a React application. So all this is still coming up. So stay tuned and please subscribe if you like the video. Thank you for watching.